Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Adrian Yo. We will be live in a couple of minutes' time. We are waiting for our speaker, which will be coming in pretty soon. So, those of you on following us on Google Hangout, you still have time to grab yourself a cup of tea or go to the bathroom. We will resume in 5 minutes' time. See ya.
me? Oh, hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Looks like all our technical stuff has been sorted out. Tonight, our third series of the MYD training series, we have Chris Wright, who wears many hats. I shall not. I shall let Chris himself to introduce himself to you. And without further ado, I'll pass the mic to him. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone online, and more importantly, hello, everyone here. I've just been able to meet most of you, but hopefully throughout the night we'll get a few more questions, discussion a bit, and we'll get to know each other a bit more. Please come in. And just in case you're watching online, there's about 250, maybe 300 people here. So a lot of my focus is going to be on those live. But hopefully you'll be able to join with us online and enjoy it. We do have some slides going up at the moment in the background, thanks to Adrian, as you can see. And I'm sure that he'll pass them on to anyone who wants to watch. So just send Adrian an email, and I'm sure he'll be able to link you in with the slides. But at the moment, we have a slide that says, "Welcome to the UN climate negotiations." And perhaps I can see if we can see it there. Kind of, that'll give Adrian a bit of a guide later on anyway. But yeah, so this is not awkward. My name's Chris, and I have been working on climate change negotiations since about 2011. I've been involved in climate change kind of research or activism or involvement since about 2008. But in 2011 was my first chance to go to a UN climate negotiation, which is largely what I'm going to be talking about tonight. And I'm going to be talking a lot about how young people have been involved in UN climate negotiations throughout the years that I've been involved, and then also for a few years before I was involved. And hopefully that will give you all a bit of a perspective on what you could expect at the end of the year in Paris, whether you go to Paris or whether you just simply want to be kind of have an understanding when all of the media starts to hype up. Expect a lot of media coverage, regardless of where you like to get your media from, but expect a lot around the first 2 weeks of December, and perhaps in the week leading up to it as well. Because most likely you'll have one of the largest gatherings of heads of state that has ever assembled at any kind of conference or negotiations on anything, and they'll be talking a lot about climate change. So hopefully I'll be able to introduce a little bit of what they're going to be talking about, and then specifically talk about how young people have been involved in the past and how potentially you could be involved in the future. And then at the end, I'll talk specifically about what I do. But just to get an understanding of the room, how about we just go around very, very quickly. There's about 250 people, so I'll just get a sample of maybe like 7 or 8 as like a random sample. Just maybe just a front row, go around and just introduce yourself and introduce maybe what it is you understand about the UN climate negotiations in one sentence, and try and not say something that someone else has said. So if you say you don't know, maybe say like you don't know in another language or maybe in another way of phrasing it. I don't know. But let's start from here. Oh, that was good. So Sonia's already taken that I have no idea card. No one else is allowed to play that card. You have to think of another card that's closely aligned. But I don't know, trading card or something. All right. Well, that was a small sample of the group we have here, but I believe in random samples, and that's about the idea of the room. If you have other kind of perspectives on what you understand on the negotiations or any questions, I'm sure you can either email Adrian or you can tweet at me right now, and I'll get to it later on. Um, but basically, let's get into it. So, what is the UN climate negotiations? Well, it basically that slide explains it. It's not what you think it is. It's probably not as good as you think it is, but it's probably not as bad as you think it is either. In the end, you'll never know, but you never really have to. So, my message to everyone who wants to know about the negotiations is it's not as scary as it sounds. It's not as complicated as a lot of people make it seem, but if you really dive into it, it is much, much more complicated than you'll ever need to know about. And this kind of links into what I'm going to say later on, which is if you want to get involved in the climate negotiations, if you want to have an influence on it, you don't need to know everything that's going on. You need to pick one thing. You need to kind of learn about the one thing that you want to try and shape or influence, and then focus on that. And at the end of the day, a lot of these negotiations at a very, very kind of deep level happen on a very kind of diplomatic, bureaucratic involved in. And actually, where you do need to be involved in is taking it from the diplomatic level, the bureaucratic level, and putting it into the public perspective and making it understandable to the public. Because if voters care about certain issues, then they're going to tell politicians, and politicians are going to make sure that bureaucrats make the right decisions. So basically, it's been going on since 1990 in a way. And so that's why you might have heard some people make some speeches, and we'll see them later on, where they say, "You've been negotiating my whole life." Where some of my friends have got up, made speeches, and literally, it's right. They've been negotiating these things throughout the last 20, 25, 23 years. Well, 20, yeah, 23 years. This year is going to be called what they call the 21st Conference of Parties, parties being negotiating countries. So it's the 21st year that they've got together and they've negotiated things. So that's why I say it's probably not as good as you think. If you know any job and people have been talking about a job for 21 years and not yet doing it good enough, then you probably get an idea that it's not going as well as you might assume it would be. However, it's a very, very complicated process. It has a lot of different political levels going on, and it's not as simple as simply just kind of deciding, okay, we're going to do things right now. Um, and a key example is economic competitiveness. So, for example, here in Malaysia, you have one large company that creates a lot of economic growth for the country that might not be so well off if suddenly the whole world started making kind of big pushes against fossil fuel subsidies or kind of making a significant shift towards, for example, electronic vehicles. So Petronas would not be kind of able to operate in that sort of economy right now unless they made some significant shifts towards other kind of non-fossil fuel or non-kind of polluting industries, and therefore Malaysian economy might kind of suffer quite a bit. So there's a lot of things like that around the world that have meant that on the surface level, the negotiations haven't been able to progress so fast, but then there's a lot more complicated underlevels that that affect a lot of different things that you don't necessarily need to know about, but you just need to know that there is a lot of complicated progress that has been made, and hopefully you'll have the opportunity to shape some of that progress in another direction. So This will be the only time for the next about 10 minutes that I'm going to get super technical. So if you're worried right now, don't be too worried. Um, Basically, I'm just going to go through exactly what's happened over the last 12 months, and this might be a little bit complicated, and this will make no sense to any of you. If it makes sense to any of you right now, then I am absolutely shocked, and probably you should be holding the microphone instead of me. Basically, last year in Lima, there was the 20th round of these negotiations. And leading into Lima, they made a bunch of decisions kind of going into it that would affect the negotiations this year. And then they made a few decisions in Lima that affect negotiations this year as well. One of the key decisions is what they call the INDCs. So the INDC is going to be the second last acronym that I'm going to use tonight. So I'm sorry about it. But basically, it's a national climate change plan. So they got together and they said, okay, this year we're going to make a big decision on what everyone in the world can do. But in order to do that, we need to have everyone in the world, every country in the world, put forward an idea of what they think they could possibly do. So right now, all the countries are expected to produce what's called, no, I'm not even going to explain the acronym because you don't need to fill your head with this nonsense. But they're going to produce a national climate change plan that has to be in some sort of shape that they've all agreed on that says that they are going to contribute X amount to the process. So far, Malaysia has not yet done that. We're expecting that Malaysia will produce their plan in October. And there's been a few of the bigger countries and economies, so the EU, China, US, Canada, Switzerland, a bunch of other countries, and a lot of developing countries as well. So Gabon, you have Morocco, Ethiopia, you have Mexico, who have also made kind of these national plans. And if anyone wants me to kind of go into that later on, I can talk about what some of the other countries have proposed and what potentially Malaysia could propose, because this could be something that you could work on. But basically, they decided in Lima that they were going to do these INDCs. They're going to have these and that they were going to release them this year. They then made a lot of progress on what they call the ADP, which is an acronym, and this is going to be the last acronym of the night. And hopefully, it will get more exciting after this. But basically, they then had this process that they started in 2012, where they said, okay, by 2015, we're going to try and create a system where everyone in the world is involved in making cuts on climate, on making greenhouse gas emissions cuts. So everyone in the world. In the past, it was only developed countries, and developing countries were just kind of involved in another way. But now everyone in the world is going to be involved in similar ways. Not the exact same way, but similar ways. So they made progress on that. And then they did a lot of other kind of complicated negotiating kind of aspects that relate to forestry, that relate to the way land use is kind of brought into things, the way they calculate emissions in different ways, and then a whole other kind of element on how they implement these kind of talks. So you don't necessarily need to know all that, but if you do want to get involved, I can very much recommend specific topics that you can dive into and try and change. And finally, that's going to be the last acronym I use, I promise. Please don't use acronyms around me. I've got like post-traumatic stress disorder from too many acronyms. And if you come to any of these other negotiations like talks that the Malaysian Climate Youth, I'm getting that wrong, Malaysian Youth Delegation is holding this year, I'm sure you'll hear a lot more. Please don't invite me to those talks because, like I said, I have some stress issues. Anyway, so basically what's happening this year, we had some interim conferences at the start of the year. We had one in Geneva. We had one in Bonn recently, so Bonn's in Germany. We're going to have another one in Germany, and then we're going to have another one at the end of the year in Paris, in France. Sorry, two more in Germany, and then that's what it says on the slide. It says two more. So potentially during those periods, so the end of August, start of September, and October 25th to 29th, you're going to hear some news stories about climate change. There's going to be some other events throughout the year, like the Climate Week at the end of September, where they're going to be talking about it as well. Basically, they're going to be progressing these negotiations slowly towards it. They are mainly talking about this one draft document, which is going to be the agreement, which covers a whole variety of things. You know, they've got these words: mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology, capacity building, transparency, all this stuff. So these are some of the more complicated elements of the climate change negotiations, and this is largely why it's taken 21 years to make progress. So I'll break down these headings one by one, just slowly. Mitigation is trying to reduce the amount of emissions that we put into the atmosphere. Adaptation is trying to figure out how we deal with what is already kind of a changing climate system and how we deal with climate change into the future. Finance is largely about how developed countries should be helping developing countries with money to try and figure out not only how they might develop technologies to kind of change their economies towards more renewable based economies, but also how they might deal with some of these impacts of climate change. Technology transfer is when they directly might transfer technologies made specifically in Germany or the US and transfer that here to Malaysia, and they might be able to use that technology because it might help fast track some of their ability to change the economy. Capacity building is all about how some of these processes are very technical and you need some people with technical expertise. And this is all about how they kind of develop the technical expertise, particularly in developing countries. Transparency of action and support, that's just about reports and how they're going to make things accountable. This has been a particularly big issue around the world because as anyone who's ever worked in finance or anyone who's ever worked in kind of any type of international business knows different countries do things differently. And when it comes to like a lot of money and a lot of kind of international agreements, this has been a bit of a nervous issue for a lot of people, particularly so developed countries who might be giving finance to developing countries and might not necessarily think that they do things exactly the way they should. Time frames and processes, that's all about kind of exactly what it means, the time frame of action, the types of processes that are going to happen and when they're going to happen. It doesn't sound too important, but one of the key things there is whether they review actions on a 5-year period or a 10-year period. 5-year period means that they have a review after 5 years and then people think, okay, should we do things differently? 10-year period means they don't get to do it in a 5 years and they do it after 10 years. Some people are nervous about that. Facilitating and implementing compliance, don't worry about it. The other stuff means absolutely nothing. So what happened in Bonn? Not much, to be honest. They talked a lot. They reduced the text from 86 pages to 80 pages. Congratulations on 2 weeks of work. And then they basically, but what they did agree on is that they've come to a point where they're ready to make some significant changes in the text, which is good. So basically, they're ready to make significant progress. However, feel free to be pessimistic about that. They've been saying that for the last 21 years. Anyway, are we on track? So outside of these negotiations, this is some stuff you might have heard in the media. So in the media so far this year, we've heard, for example, the G7 all got together in Germany earlier this year, and they said, hey, let's make this agreement whereby we promise not to use fossil fuels after 2100. We promise not to burn fossil fuels after then. Now that's the G7, so that's not every country in the world, but it is some of the major economies, literally the 7 major economies minus one economy who a lot of people don't like right now. But basically they made a lot of strong commitments, and that includes, you know, Canada and Japan, who previously have been kind of more of the not so progressive countries in recent years. There's been a lot of other bilateral agreements that the US in particular has been forging. They have an agreement with China that they announced last year that was quite kind of big press moment. They made some agreements with Brazil this year, which are quite significant. And there's recently, so this top story is from literally yesterday. So there was recently some negotiations kind of progress that may make things a little bit easier in the future and may mean that the negotiations that are going to start again in Bonn pretty soon are going to go a little bit easier. Specifically, they talked about that time frame that I mentioned before, and that they said maybe the 5 years assessment is a good idea, which a lot of countries are pretty happy about. And then they also talked about the one of the key issues in the negotiations, which is how do we make sure that developed countries are doing their bit while developing countries are also involved, but not doing something that is kind of ignorant of the fact that developed countries have been the biggest culprits in climate change for a long, long time. And they figured out some sort of self-differentiation, which they're going to kind of try and progress throughout the rest of the year. So that was really good. Basically, we had good news recently. And then I get to young people. So what about young people in the negotiations? Basically, young people have been involved in the negotiations since 2009, actively involved. We've been involved before that, but we created our own little kind of youth constitution coalition in the negotiations in 2009. Adrian was there and was part of some of the founding members of the youth constituency. And since 2009, they've been kind of actively involved inside the negotiations. So I know kind of the negotiations probably are still a pretty foreign idea to a lot of you, but basically they have this specific role within the negotiations, not as a country to negotiate, but as a group of people who are kind of involved, have really good access to negotiators, can make statements in the UN, can kind of present ideas to different countries, and can kind of organize protests and many kind of actions within the negotiations. So it's been a lot of fun. Basically, young people have added a lot of color, they've added a lot of vibrancy, and they've added actually a lot of really sensible ideas to this process for the last kind of 6 years. And that's where I've been involved. So I've been involved since 2011, and I've been kind of actively involved within an organizational perspective, so my NGO, as well as within kind of the broader youth group, whereby all these people who come from different countries and different NGOs get together and say, what can we do together? So you have young Malaysians working with young French people, working with young Australians, working with young Americans, working with young Latinos, young Africans, the rest of Asia, you know. And it's really exciting and it's really interesting, and there's been a lot of really great progress that they've been involved in throughout the years. They have an official group, they call it Youngo, the youth NGOs, and that has an official place within the UN system, and literally any of you can be a part of it if you want to be a part of it. Most young people actually are active in that group online, as opposed to physically being there, just because of the costs and the limitations of attending. But you have as much access and as much responsibility and decision-making power in an online facility as you do when you're physically there. And later on, if you guys are interested, I can show you a lot of ways that you can actually probably track the negotiations that are happening, particularly in December, even better than you can when you're physically there, just because you're not so stressed and running around crazy. That's if you want to. Otherwise, you can, I'm sure, track a lot of news stories and track kind of different organizations that are going to be presenting different ideas, particularly the Malaysian youth delegation who will be there. But saying that, young people have had a pretty important role in the negotiations for a long time. And I'm going to show you some key examples of how they've been involved. But before I do that, I think now is probably a pretty good time to slow down a little bit, get a bit of a reaction from yourselves, get some questions, some answers, and see kind of how we can capitalize on what has probably been a pretty boring, pretty kind of technical and strange little briefing on what the negotiations are at the moment. So let's go around again, the opposite direction. Hopefully we won't say like, I don't know anything, but this time maybe just ask one question. That can be any question you might have, top of your head, something related to what I talked about, or just kind of something totally different. So go for it. So within different countries, there's obviously different ways that things should be done. And the negotiations change location every year. So last year they were in Peru. The year before that they were in Poland. The year before that they were in Qatar. This year they're going to be in Paris at the end of the year. There's also always also negotiations in the middle of the year where it's kind of like a stepping stone practice. So we noticed definitely that the geography determines a lot of the actions young people can do. So for example, in Qatar, they're not so used to having kind of protests and civil society kind of things. In Poland, they had a very different reaction. In Peru, they had a very different reaction. So sometimes that plays into it a little bit. And then I guess you also have the element of if you are campaigning specifically from your country, what does your country specifically relate that to? So for example, an Australian delegation, negotiator, might interpret a protest very differently to a Saudi Arabian negotiator, or a Malaysian negotiator might interpret something different to a French negotiator. This is all kind of cultural stuff that usually we leave up to the youth or the NGOs from that country to kind of figure out the best way to go forward. But there is certainly different kind of cultural elements involved. Yeah. So that was somewhat an element of young people around the world getting realizing that, like, getting interested in the topic, and the creation of youth-based NGOs in a number of different places. So the US, in Europe, and then linking in with a number of other kind of, in Australia, for example, and they started to realize that, well, we're doing similar things in a lot of places. Let's maybe get together and focus on these negotiations because they affect us. And then they had a few very kind of enthusiastic and intelligent young people who approached the UN and said, "Hey, we would like to be a specific kind of specifically involved as youth." So they previously had a relationship for NGOs. So environmental NGOs had their own kind of place within these negotiations, and a few of the young people who were involved in those, and they said, "Hey, but what about a specific one for young people?" And so they basically worked with the secretariat very closely for a number of months to create it leading up to 2009, and then had a really great kind of group of young people in 2009, and every year have kind of played this weird, we're campaigning, we're putting pressure, we're like demanding better negotiations, but also we're behaving, so don't kick us out. And there's always this kind of very close line between um, young people trying to push for too much change, and young people kind of being a very powerful and positive force. And we basically created the situation whereby negotiators from a large majority of countries really appreciate the the energy and the kind of campaigns that we bring, um, and a very small amount of negotiators are kind of pissed off that we're involved. So we cultivate that every year. So I'm gonna kind of go through a bit of another kind of section of this little discussion about that. But definitely I would there's a few ways that you can prepare already online. So you can kind of, through Adrian, be involved directly in kind of the email lists that are affiliated with the youth NGOs. You can definitely kind of try and link up with other youth in the region. So there is a specific Asian youth group within the kind of international youth climate group that a little bit more relevant, kind of talks about specific Asian issues. And for example, tomorrow there's going to be a power shift starting in Singapore of ASEAN young people. You can definitely kind of get involved in that group online and see what they're going to plan leading up to the negotiations. I think that would be a great start. And then I'll show you kind of specifically how to prepare yourself in the negotiations later. Yeah. I mean, I'm fortunate in that I'm originally from Australia, and in Australian culture, we drink a lot of alcohol, so that usually supports um, my ability to continue. But but no, you struggle with it all the time. Um, you go through a lot of stress, a lot of ups and downs. You go through a lot of feelings of disillusionment and feelings of, you're so close and then everything kind of falls apart. But basically, there's this unfortunateness of people coming to the negotiations as youth in particular, hoping that they can change everything, and then kind of when everything doesn't change, then thinking like, oh, okay, we can't do anything. Um, but I think you need to bring the same sort of mindset that you bring to this, that you bring to any kind of political change or even change within a business organization. Like, if anyone's kind of working to make change within any organization, you're not going to be able to change the whole organization. If you work on the third floor of the Petronas Towers, you're not going to be able to change things on the 50th floor straight away. But maybe you can kind of make very small changes, and kind of try and enjoy those small changes and be very targeted in exactly kind of what you want to change. And so people with that mindset do a lot better. People who enjoy themselves do a lot better. Um, and people who kind of Also, focus on building relationships with negotiators that will last for a while, do a lot better as well. So you might not kind of get a win this time, but if you keep a close relationship with the negotiator, it means you're one step closer to even getting there next time. And you'll find most of these negotiators are dealing with um, a whole string of bureaucratic decisions that they are just the end of. And you are kind of one of those elements into their decision-making process. So most of the time, even if they don't pick your, I guess, make a decision that you agree with, if you like conduct yourself in a pretty smart, passionate way, they're probably going to respect you, and they're probably going to look for your opinion next time, and they're probably going to be open to your ideas next time. And that's kind of an experience I've had personally, whereby I've had a lot of, my little campaigns fall flat on their faces, but um, after a while, people start to notice you if you put a lot of passion, energy, and you do it intelligently. And after a while, you start to create those relationships which can make a lot more progress in the future. Sure. So I'm specifically talking only about the climate change negotiations. So that's global warming. Um, there are negotiations on a whole string of other things that have similar kind of long-term, slowly moving negotiations, and there are similar youth groups involved in those. I'm specifically only kind of focusing on climate change. So obviously, I think that's a priority, and I guess to compete with other negotiating tracks, the negotiations of 2009 were the largest gathering of heads of state ever. So I guess we're more important than the others. And probably this year you're going to see, we've already seen Obama make very, very big statements about how this is a priority for him. We've seen the head of China, the head of India, the head of Brazil also come out and say this is a really key issue for them as well this year. So I would like to say climate change is a key issue this year, and I know that a lot of people who are kind of working in this space probably agree, but people who work on whaling probably disagree with me dramatically, and you know all the other issues as well. Yeah. So, do you mean negotiated community in terms of people following or working specifically? Yeah. So, well, this is probably something that Adrian and the other members of the Malaysian youth delegation are much better kind of to answer. But I guess to specifically like address it, you have a very small amount of people who are specifically following this, generally in most countries. So it's not a criticism of Malaysians at all. It's a criticism of the way that this has kind of been a very small bubble, if you think about it around the world. Um, in Australia, there's a number of NGOs who kind of work in this space, but the amount of people who specifically know about the negotiations is very limited. In Malaysia, it's a similar kind of, I guess, dynamic where you have NGOs who work on forests, who work on indigenous communities, who work on kind of rivers and things. But the amount of people who specifically follow the negotiations is pretty small. And that's kind of makes it very difficult for, I guess, Malaysians to try and make change at the negotiations, but also for the Malaysian negotiators, the government officials, to kind of stand up and make really strong progressive statements. Because if there isn't that kind of domestic challenge, that domestic support, then they have no politician is going to make up a policy without people trying to bring it forward towards them in the first place. So if you want to become one of the few people who follow these negotiations, potentially you have a lot of power. I mean, one of the crazy things about these negotiations is like you are so close to very, very powerful people all around the world. Like you probably catch the bus in the morning to the negotiations So my own examples. One day I sat with the Egyptian Minister for the Environment for 2.5 hours in traffic, and we talked all about their new coal plant that they are planning to develop, the first one ever in Egypt. I have sat very, very close with ministers of the environment from a whole range of countries on buses, on taxis, on like at bars, in the negotiations, late night, at restaurants, everything like that. You have this amazing proximity to negotiators, to high-level diplomats, to politicians, even to heads of state. So I've met a number of heads of state through this kind of just being involved. And the fact that you want to be involved, suddenly you are in this very, very small grouping of people who kind of know about this stuff, and you have this amazing power to affect like this global, somewhat democratic kind of decision making. So I know, for example, that members of the Malaysian youth delegation have very, very close relationships with Malaysian negotiators, and that if there were any Malaysians that did go to the negotiations, you can imagine if you were surrounded by 196 different nationalities and you saw one other Malaysian who wanted to go makan with you, you probably make pretty good friends with them, regardless of their opinions on other things. So you have this amazing ability to kind of affect change in a quite remarkable way if you do want to get involved. Yeah, they do. So you remember the slide that I put up that had mitigation, adaptation, capacity building, all of those kind of headings, they represented where the negotiating text had gone from one amount of pages to another amount of pages. That happens all throughout negotiations. So I haven't ever kind of, I'm not up to date with Wright now, but I think at any given time there's probably more than 8 different negotiating tracks that are going on at once. Um, different subgroups of different kind of issues. And it's very, very hard to track of all things that are going on at once, let alone the fact that one negotiating issue will probably be negotiated on the first day, and the third day, and the fourth day, and the seventh day. So for you to figure out what's going on all the time, it's almost impossible. That's why later on I'm going to talk about just picking one thing that you're passionate about, trying to learn as much as that you can about that, but specifically just learning what are the kind of key issues and what do you really believe should happen in those negotiations. So things that specifically affect kind of Malaysia and the Malaysians are interested in would be the type of things that you'd be going for, and whether you think that's adaptation relating to kind of specifically relating to farmers in Malaysia, for example, whether you think that's kind of mitigation, if you think developing countries like Malaysia should be doing more to adopt renewable technologies, whether you think that developed countries should be paying more to Malaysia to kind of support this. These are the types of things that usually people just go, okay, I want to focus on this, and then figure out what the key kind of aspects of it are, and then make change. Yes. So I'm just trying to line up the next little bit of slides. You know, I got black here. Wait, I got an idea. Hey. So while we're waiting, I think I find it really difficult to sit down and listen to someone talk about stupid things for a long time. So that's the example of me. So let's stand up for a sec. Many people, so many people think that we displace the daily all the time, and that's kind of true, because the negotiations can be so technical and so complicated. At the end of the day, we have to negotiate how we can protect our people and things like that. So it should be really important. It should be kind of really high level, but also it feels like really kind of really technical. They argue about moments and stuff, all of this stuff. So, does anyone have a particular idea they want to say that, or are they open to me picking what they anyway, all right, so one game that I like to play is called Definitely, but it's kind of a bit hard to play with. So you kind of need to have you think that'll be okay? So you can be but you need to step forward for like a little bit. So the way this game works is my favorite thing to motivate people in the morning. In the coffee, within like use of your hand, iPad, so I need to kind of tap out to the and you don't always have to do it. Have to pass energy around. First way you do it is you go that, but you go in the same direction. So that continues the energy in the same direction. Yeah, so if I go, so believe it or not, you have to say that like this. So there's just action and sound associated with it. Yeah, really embarrassing. But like all things, not as embarrassing as more people do it. Yeah. So ready? I go that.
Hello. Hi.
All right, good. So the next one is, yeah, and how does, wow. I didn't think you'd have to go as well. All right, so happens when you want to reverse the process. So if you want to kind of continue the process, you say, no, zap. So zap continues it, and zing reverses it. Yeah, exactly. So for example, if I go zap, almost, sorry, there's another action that's associated with it. So zing, you have to like, kind of like Zen energy, and the energy comes into you, and the chakras spin around, and then you kind of reverse it like that. So it comes into your body and then you reverse it. So you go zing. Yeah, but so if I go that, you then go. Okay, that's possible. Or yeah. Did you feel it go into your chakras and like yeah, exactly. All right, ready? So if I go that, so you need to zing. Yeah. Okay. So ready? That. All right, and then I go that. Alright, so that's what happens. You get confused and you look stupid, and that's why everyone laughs. So, we have some other moves though. So you got kind of cornered there for a bit, didn't you? Yeah, so you probably wanted like some special techniques to like break the ball. One of the techniques you can use, which is one of my favorite things to do in the world, is to go boing. So if you go boing, then it skips you the person next to you, and it goes. So it's like the energy goes into your head, and then you bounce it over the next person, and it's really fun. So now so we'll go. All right, it's embarrassing if you're doing it individually. So everyone, act of trust on one, and not on zero. On one. Adrian has to join. So on one, and all of you playing at home as well. Most of our crowd's gone away, but we've got that small sample who's allowed to play. Everyone on one, so 3, 2. Imagine I say the one. On the one, everyone go boing. All right, ready? So 3. I'm trusting you all. Yeah. And we're all trusting each other here. Yes. It's like a weird thing. So ready? 3. Boing. All right, we almost all did it. So ready? One more time. 3. Boing. All right, we're pretty good. So that means that it's Adrian, that's me. That's me. No, you're that's me. So you have to do that. Where you should have been involved before. So you say that, and I go boing, and it skips. No, it skips you, and you do the that. You see? It's tricky. No, but it can be very fun. The final move, I don't even, should I give you the final move? I don't know. There is more. It's not just, no. Or, wow, you're so good. You should go to you. I feel like I'm on a game show and you're like my assistant. All right, so there is a final move. It's called Zoom. And in Zoom, you have to make eye contact, but not in like a sleepy dancer way. You have to kind of make eye contact in like a kind of nice, sensitive. I see someone in the park and I'm lost and I need direction. Zoom kind of way, and then you do that, and then you can send the energy directly to them, and then they zap on either side they want. So, for example, if Adrian zaps me, and I go Zoom. So this is why Adrian should have been involved before, and now it's like an idiot. So, unfortunately, yes, good point of clarification. However, this is what we call being losers when they do that thing that's like, poor guys, we want to so, unfortunately, we don't have a move for like an intervention, but if you want to think of one, we can maybe do that later. So I keep my eyes to the ground, nobody can see me. Or you're going to make things really awkward. Who does try to make eye contact with you? Yeah. So, the only way that this is fun, well, there's many ways this is fun. It's generally a fun thing. However, the best way that this is fun is if people are like super energetic and they make a lot of noise and they make like really loud sounds like that, like that. everyone, gain submission from each other would be really stupid. It's like when you're on a dance floor and you see someone dancing really, really stupidly, or if you're a side to side, yeah, true. Or if you're at an open house and someone's going crazy into the food, then you have permission to also go a little bit crazy with your food. So, are we all ready? Gotta get ready for this. And also, unfortunately, we're now into elimination zone. So that may scare some of you. It may not scare others. But if you react too slowly, or if you act kind of like, you have to sit down and then get really excited about the next part of the talk, which is going to be entirely more exciting than the first part of my talk, luckily for me. So, are we ready? So you sure you're ready by doing this? Wait, one question. Why is this game called? You have to keep doing this. Why is this game called that thing about that thing going? So I get what you're saying. I mean, similar topics, they always like to include all of the aspects of it. However, sometimes you just have to say that's where we stop, that's where we name it. That's it. Like we call it like address. Yeah. All right. Because that's what it's called, all right? I didn't name it. Why is it called Malaysia? All right. Ready? Why is it not called like the 13 federated states of Malaysia, including Sabah and Sarawak and Kelantan and come on. You just have to stop somewhere. All right. Ready? All right. So the way we start this game and the way we start every time someone's eliminated is you look around the circle and it's whoever's ready to go. So it's like Wild Wild West, whoever's ready to pull the trigger. So I think you should have, and that may have created confusion. So let that round pass. Ready? No more Mr. Nice Guy though. People will be eliminated this time. Can I start off with a zoom? Da! All right. Yeah. So we have like a rule in this game. It's like basically, if the circle stops, that's when someone's eliminated. So we actually had a moment where someone did something wrong, but was saved by the someone next to them, just continuing, and therefore the game progressed, and someone was about to continue existing. So it kind of runs like that. If everyone in the circle's like, oh, you will, then you're out. But if it progresses, it goes. We come into the center. So that happens sometimes. Alright. So you can't zap across the circle. Zap! So honestly, everyone yes. Alright. Zap! Zap! Alright, no one knows. Ding. Excuse me. All right. Cut. Tap. Boing. Tap. All right. So we're down to 3, and that's basically it. Unfortunately, even though that's the can't stand nobody. So thanks for getting through the tough part. I just felt like I had to kind of get through some part of the negotiation. But like I said, you don't necessarily need to know all of the finance details. You don't need to know everything that's going on. If you do decide to kind of dive into it in a really, really close, I'm going to watch this particular thing really closely, then you can obviously kind of use Adrian and myself as kind of guides into what you might want to dive into and kind of get all the background information you need. But that was just kind of a way of me showing that generally negotiations happen for a while, there's always technical issues, and these are kind of some of the more technical stuff. Using the microphone is important. Yeah, it's on. It's on. I can basically Whitney Houston right now. So yeah, any karaoke requests? Basically, no. If you want to dive into it, you can. But I'll give you a little brief into what can young people really do at the UN climate negotiations. And I do have Wi-Fi, I understand, so this might get a little bit weird with the F things, but hopefully it won't. So you can do really cool speeches. This is a shot of a very good friend of mine, Anjali, who in 2012, no, who I first met in 2011, and she is from the US originally, but she has a lot of family in India, and she has been kind of a very prominent young person in these climate negotiations ever since, and she's now kind of a really great campaigner for kind of climate change and climate justice in particular. And this is a speech that a group of young people from the youth constituency got together, worked late nights, put together, wrote, and then she performed it, as you can see, quite amazingly. And I'll just.
Are being held today at the climate change conference to protest the failure of world leaders to immediately agree to a deal of binding emissions cuts. Earlier today, Anjali Apardai, a student at the College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine, addressed the conference on behalf of youth delegates.
Now I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Anjali Appadurai with College of the Atlantic, who will speak on behalf of youth non-governmental organizations. Ms. Appadurai, you have the floor.
I speak for more than half the world's population. We are the silent majority. You've given us a seat in this hall, but our interests are not on the table. What does it take to get a stake in this game? Lobbyists, corporate influence, money? You've been negotiating all my life. In that time, you've failed to meet pledges, you've missed targets, and you've broken promises. But you've heard this all before. We're in Africa, home to communities on the front line of climate change. The world's poorest countries need funding for adaptation now. The Horn of Africa and those nearby in Kwamashu needed it yesterday. But as 2012 dawns, our Green Climate Fund remains empty. The International Energy Agency tells us we have 5 years until the window to avoid irreversible climate change closes. The science tells us that we have 5 years maximum. You're saying, give us 10. The most stark betrayal of your generation's responsibility to ours is that you call this ambition. Where is the courage in these rooms? Now is not the time for action. In the long run, these will be seen as the defining moments of an era in which narrow self-interest prevailed over science, reason, and common compassion. There is real ambition in this room, but it's been dismissed as radical, deemed not politically possible. Stand with Africa. Long-term thinking is not radical. What's radical is to completely alter the planet's climate, to betray the future of my generation, and to condemn millions to death by climate change. What's radical is to write off the fact that change is within our reach. 2011 was the year in which the silent majority found their voice, the year when the bottom shook the top 2011 was the year when the radical became reality. Common but differentiated and historical responsibility are not up for debate. Respect the foundational principles of this convention. Respect the integral values of humanity. Respect the future of your descendants. Mandela said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." So, distinguished delegates and governments around the world, governments of the developed world, deep cuts now. Get it done.
So she did that. So she wrote that, and in a small group of young people, we kind of applied for that spot to have that speech, and then she actually did that speech entirely thinking that she was going to be thrown out, especially that part at the end where she stands up and kind of starts shouting, and did that after a lot of debate and a lot of kind of discussion about whether we should do it or not. And she entirely thought that she was going to get thrown out, and every single person who stood up at the back thought they were going to get thrown out as well. They only thought maybe through some lucky chance in power of numbers that potentially they wouldn't. But basically at the UN, young people have the opportunity to make speeches, especially at these climate change negotiations. And those speeches are basically as powerful as you make it. So as a young person, if you decide to go to the UN climate negotiations, you can make a speech as powerful as that. There's no reason why you can't. It all has to do with your preparation, the passion that you put into it. And Anjali obviously showed a great example of being really passionate and making some kind of real significant effect on negotiators, significant effect on the NGO community, and a significant public effect as well. That was kind of big news that day. She was on the New York Times, everything like that. So this is like a real opportunity for young people to create some real media pressure on these negotiations, and that's also a real interpersonal pressure. Like to do that in someone's face is obviously going to leave a mark. So you can also stop people speaking. Young people can make big speeches, but you can also make big other things. So in this next video I'm showing you, members of Sustain Us, a US NGO, and in particular a young girl called Abigail, will protest a negotiator, their national negotiator speaking from the US. But the reason why I'm showing you this is because these people, they didn't just protest their speech. I wouldn't necessarily just show you something for protest's sake. You guys know what a protest is. I'm guessing you know you have your own opinions over whether protest is good or not. Why I'm showing you this is that they did it very, very intelligently. They did it knowing that they would be kicked out. They did it knowing the risks that it would kind of entail, but they did it with a press release ready to go. They did it with statements ready to go. They did it briefing media already, and they did it kind of in a way that they guaranteed themselves a lot of media attention for what they were doing. So they understood that sure, they might make a bit of an impression in the negotiations, but if they do it smartly, if they brief media beforehand, if they kind of get a press release ready to go, if they get especially photographers in the room and video cameras in the room, then they can actually turn this into a very, very big spectacle. And that's what you're about to see. So hopefully this will work. Yeah. So very brave, very powerful, but also very intelligent. The way that they put that together, the way that they briefed media beforehand. This was also on the first day of negotiations. So they didn't wait. They didn't kind of like, oh, you know, all this stuff. They decided, no, we're going to interrupt. Morally, we're going to protest. We're going to interrupt our negotiator speaking because we don't believe they should have the right to speak. Obviously, they didn't stop them speaking the whole time, but they had that kind of moral impetus. But also, if you think about the context of the negotiations, to get a big news story in the US on day one of negotiations where nothing dramatic is going to happen sets a media cycle in place and gets the media kind of interested in this story for the whole 2 weeks. So these negotiations at the end of the year go for 2 weeks. And they basically started off with a New York Times article on day one of negotiations where literally nothing else newsworthy would have happened. That negotiator would have made a speech that would have said all of these kind of very vague things about climate change in the US, and they created the news story and therefore automatically engaged not everyone in the US, but engaged a lot of people in the US, particularly engaged policymakers and said that, you know, you guys are suddenly on watch. You better not kind of play around too much. You better make positive statements. And the US negotiators were very weary that entire negotiating period because of that media pressure. So you can also make heroes. So what I'm about to say is a little bit controversial and everything like that, but basically on screen you have here who at the time was simply a negotiator from the Philippines at a time when the Philippines was facing some very, very dramatic typhoons from that have kind of science has displayed quite clearly that the power and the potentially the frequency of typhoons, especially in the Pacific affecting the Philippines, is increasing dramatically as a result of climate change. And the Philippines has seen massive increases in the kind of the force and the frequency of typhoons in the last couple of years. And unfortunately, there's usually a really, really big one that affects them during kind of late November, early December, and that is always around the time of the climate negotiations. So what you're going to see here is a very
trickles in agonizingly slow manner because power lines and communication lines have been cut off and may take a while before they are restored. The initial assessment showed that Haiyan left a wake of massive destruction that is unprecedented, unthinkable, and horrific. And the devastation is staggering. I struggle to find words even for the images that we see on the news coverage. And I struggle to find words to describe how I feel about the losses. Up to this hour, I agonized, waiting for word to the fate of my very own relatives. What gives me renewed strength and great relief is that my own brother has communicated to us and he had survived the onslaught. I speak for my delegation, but I speak for the countless people who will no longer be able to speak for themselves after perishing from the storm. I speak also for those who have been orphaned by the storm. I speak for those who have the people now raising its time to save survivors and alleviate the suffering of the people affected. We can take drastic action now to ensure that we prevent a future where super typhoons become a way of life. Can we ever attain the ultimate objective of the convention, which is to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system? By failing to meet the objective of the convention, we may have ratified our own doom. We have to confront the issue of loss and damage. Loss and damage is a reality today across the world. We cannot solve climate change when we seek to spew more emissions. In solidarity with my countrymen who are struggling to find food back home, and with my brother who has not had food for the last 3 days, with all due respect, Mr. President, and I mean no disrespect for your kind hospitality, I will now commence a voluntary fasting for the climate. This means I will voluntarily refrain from eating food during this COP until a meaningful outcome is in sight, until concrete pledges have been made to ensure mobilization of resources for the Green Climate Fund. We cannot afford a fourth COP with an empty GCF. Until the promise of the operationalization of a loss and damage mechanism has been fulfilled, until there is assurance on financial adaptation, until we see real ambition on climate action in accordance with the principles we have so upheld. Mr. President, this process has been called a farce. It has been called an annual carbon-intensive gathering of useless frequent flyers. It has also been called saving tomorrow today. We can fix this. We can stop this madness.
So how many times do you think that that has been viewed on YouTube? How many? So YouTube gets a lot of hits for a lot of strange things. But a million hits for a political statement on very, very technical matters is a pretty good kind of amount of coverage. And it's certainly more than most other negotiators get with their speeches. So the reason why I bring it up in terms of youth participation is that unfortunately that was not the first time that Yeb had to make a speech like that. The year before, in 2012, he made almost the exact same speech as another typhoon was hitting a different part of the Philippines. And in the same way, he combined this kind of quite incredibly technical speech with this immense passion. Now, at that time, originally, he was not a large media figure. He was not well known as a big personality. He was kind of had some pretty close connections with a number of young people, though. And there was a number of young people in that room who got who got a little bit of heads up that he was going to make a dramatic speech. The young people in that room also, again, risking being thrown out. Then kind of the speech happened. It was applauded, but then people moved on. Other people made speeches. Another kind of half an hour of negotiations went on, and then they decided to leave. Young people immediately got up, stood up, made this kind of very large tunnel for Yeb, and then Yeb one by one hugged about 100 people in this tunnel, up and down the tunnel. While that was happening, a bunch of media found out that this was going on and kind of raced into the room, and there was this kind of media frenzy. And then suddenly the media got word that something had just happened, because all these young people were kind of doing this big hugging thing with this negotiator. So then the media started paying attention to him. And then throughout that negotiations, young people worked very closely with, in particular, with the Philippines delegation, creating a lot of actions, creating a lot of media moments, and also amplifying the words of this particular negotiator. As a result, he has become a very, very large public presence. Now he's become that public presence largely because of his own passion and because, as you saw in 2013, he decided to fast. But I would also say, and I'm that part of the reason that he has become such a presence is because young people have supported his kind of his actions within the negotiations with large-scale protests. So in that same negotiations in 2012, there were more than 3 protests that young people hosted in the negotiations that made the BBC, made the New York Times, that made Al Jazeera. For really important things that the journalists are like, we need something to put on the news, not just a technical story about diplomatic negotiations. Through those protests, they're able to highlight more and more the really positive work that he's doing. And I would argue that both of those things have gone hand in hand throughout his career, which kind of ended as a diplomat last year, and he's now stepped into an NGO role. But throughout his career as a diplomat, you wouldn't have the same sort of public pressure and public understanding of his kind of ideas without the young people supporting it with protests. Also, you wouldn't have kind of these great protests without someone standing up and kind of creating this space for them and having faith in young people as well. So we had this great relationship going with him, and I think that together, young people and this negotiator created a lot of change over the last couple of years in the negotiations. So this is an example of one of the protests that we've kind of hosted. This was a petition with a vase where 605,000 people signed their names in solidarity with Yeb, who I think at the time was fasting. What are some of the other ways that young people have been involved? So this is when you start to get a little bit more technical. So you can influence your delegation. So this is a young girl from the Maldives. So within the region, and also kind of a similar, if not even more difficult, I guess, political situation in terms of participation. But basically, this is one of the young people who's worked, who I've worked directly with. But on the left is a short excerpt of a story that was written about some of her work by a large media organization as well. So she worked directly with the Maldivian delegation, and because of her contacts with the young people, she worked very, very closely on a particular aspect of the negotiations and took forward kind of youth ideas and youth perspectives on that negotiations, and actually got exact text, so exact wordings of these youth ideas into the negotiating text. And ever since, other young people have kind of pushed to make sure they stay there. But this was a great example of where you get a young person makes a very close relationship with their negotiators, doesn't do the whole kind of big media stuff, doesn't do the whole like big, protests or big speeches, but works very closely on an interpersonal way and makes a significant change in the negotiations. So this is not just kind of influencing things that happen in the Maldives, but the text that the words that she puts in that legal document mean that Malaysia, Australia, US, everyone else, as long as they agree to it, will have to abide by those kind of legal elements. So this is actually a pretty influential thing that she's done, and this kind of relates to what I said before. You're just around a lot of powerful people. So another way you can do it is you can influence your region. So this is in 2012, the Arab Youth Climate Coalition got together and did a really amazing thing. Basically, a lot of the countries in the MENA region, the kind of North Africa and Middle East region, had never really had much of a kind of climate change pressure put on them, and hadn't really had a lot of civil society movements. Remember, this is 2012, so this is kind of also a very kind of interesting time for the Middle East, and in particular with civil society movements, ahead of kind of more interesting times to come, I guess. But these guys kind of got up. They were from all across the Middle East. You've got people there from Palestine, people from Egypt, people from Bahrain, people from Saudi Arabia, from Yemen, from all these different countries, got together, coordinated actions, like lobbied with negotiators, had a hell of a lot of media coverage on Al Jazeera, created a lot of kind of public understanding of climate change, and has ever since made that kind of a key part of their work. And these are people, like I said, in Palestine, Iraq, Iran, going through a lot of things. There's also members in this group from Syria, from Sudan. They're going through a lot of other kind of political elements. So I think they're kind of a bit of an inspiration for me whenever I kind of get to thinking like, oh, there's more important things going on, there's more immediate things going on. It's a wonderful reminder to have people in Syria, in Palestine, coming forward and saying, yeah, there are a lot of things going on, but still, if we don't kind of make a really positive kind of push on climate change to raise public awareness, and specifically in these negotiations, then a lot of other things are going to keep going wrong in the future. So potentially you can use these negotiations to create these groups. This group was, however, created well before the negotiations. Not all of them went to the negotiations, but they used their grouping as a way of spreading the message across the Middle East throughout the negotiations in 2012. So that's a great way of showing that you can kind of make a big impact even when you're not specifically in the negotiations. And then kind of this leads into how you specifically kind of make change within the negotiation process. You might want to get behind a key issue for youth. So within the youth, I guess, grouping constituency, there are key issues that are important. One of those is something that Anjali talked about, is that the rights of future generations to have the same sort of rights, same sort of environment to deal with. Another one might be human rights. Another one might be kind of gender sensitivity with climate change. So climate change affects women in different ways. It affects men, especially in countries where women are largely kind of working in agriculture, and significant shifts are happening with the rainfall or with the kind of weather patterns that mean that agriculture suddenly becomes a lot harder. So there's a whole range of issues that young people have got behind in the past. If you want to kind of get behind a particular issue, you can definitely kind of contact Adrian or myself and ask what are the key issues for young people. But these are some of the kind of ones that I'm talking about. A key one here, NGO participation. So that relates to the way countries involve non-governmental organizations and individuals from their countries in decision-making processes and in implementing those decisions. So here in Malaysia, how much is the government allowing you to be involved in making decisions about climate change and helping to implement those practices? So Natasha and I, for example, used to do a little bit of work in Sabah, and there you have a lot of communities that have very, very kind of different relationships with the government, and some of those communities literally require NGOs to be involved in the project management, in the kind of collaboration process, in order for there to be a kind of a productive project to happen. I'm sure you all know that there's things in your own communities, whether you live in apartments, kind of small towns, live here in Kuala Lumpur, there's definitely things that you would know about your community that your government doesn't necessarily know as well. And how much are you allowed to share that knowledge and be a part of that process? So this is kind of what it relates to NGO participation. And that's pretty important for young people, because generally around the world, and this is definitely not anywhere kind of talking about Malaysia, around the world, governments are pretty bad at involving young people in decisions and creating policies that actually young people think, hey, that's a really good idea. Usually most policies that come out were like, hey, that's really stupid. Maybe if you asked us a little bit about it, we could give you a way better idea, or at least an idea that would affect us a little bit less. So this is something that we're pretty kind of keen on advocating for. Get young people involved in decision-making processes, wherever those decisions are, and I guarantee you'll have a better decision and you'll have a better policy to implement later on. So then the key aspect, I guess this is where I get a little bit more technical, is you got to try and figure out where you can link that to the negotiations. And that requires a little bit of technical work if you want to do it on your own. And that's why I say be careful if you want to start diving into these negotiating texts. You can spend a lot of time trying to get your head around it and lose a lot of time getting your head around it. What is potentially much more useful is talking to someone like Adrian, talking to someone like myself, talking to another young person who's been involved in it, and finding out exactly what are the key aspects of that particular topic where you can make the biggest changes. But regardless of how you try and affect these negotiations or any political process, whether it's kind of local government decisions in kind of in Kuala Lumpur, in the Klang Valley, wherever it might be, you need to know kind of what the parameters are that your government's talking about. If they are talking about kind of broadband connections and connectivity, you can't suddenly jump in and say, hey, but I think Wi-Fi is better. They're going to kind of look at you and think, what are you talking about? The same way in these negotiations, you can't just jump in and say something totally outside of what they're currently talking about. You need to figure out exactly what are the drivers and what policy changes you can make. So this is, Natasha, kind of where that disillusionment is very dangerous. If you kind of dive into the text and try and make proposals that are totally outside the scope of possibility, then you're going to get disillusioned pretty quickly. If you find out from kind of key people what progress can be made, and you aim for that, that's when you can really keep your energy up. And then what I highly recommend is you create really fun media-worthy moments. So this is a shot on the beach. I think it was in 2012 in Durban, or it was maybe before that. But this is where they took. This was Cancun. Okay, so this is where they took some people in 2010 out to the beach, did a fun photo, and then created this media-worthy moment. Suddenly, you send this to a Reuters or an Al Jazeera or a New York Times, and they have this great picture to use, and you're involved in that picture, and kind of you send them the story, and then they have something to write about. So this is really fun. And this is where being a young person in the negotiations is super fun. And you can create these crazy media-worthy moments within the negotiations, on a beach, in a park, you know, create this really, really fun kind of image or a protest that media can use and use that to create pressure. And then kind of finally, you got to make sure your negotiators knew about that pressure you created. They'll be running around. They might not be reading the New York Times. They might not be reading Malaysia Kini. They might not be reading kind of even the Star where it might be produced. And therefore, you know, they just might not have picked up the paper that day. So you got to try and figure out how they know that they're under pressure. If they haven't got word from someone in the government saying, hey, what are you doing? You're on the front page of the Star this morning. Can you please not be on the front page tomorrow? I'd really appreciate that. You got to make them know that they're on the front page. So this is kind of a moment where I talked to a negotiator from the Trinidad after a young person from the Trinidad has written an article about them, and I just kind of had a discussion with them about kind of young people and the effect that they can have. So have you ever seen an article written by a young person about Trinidad?
I've seen paintings on the issue from young people from Trinidad. My ministry for foreign affairs did a competition the other day on climate change, and there was an art competition. So I've seen it done in art, but not actually in prose.
So what did you think of the article?
I think it's a good article. I think it reflects a lot of issues that are currently negotiations linking actually to what's happening on the ground now. I think the author is right in her recommendation, and I think if we have more things like this being done and more awareness being created, particularly among the young people, it will be good to help the government to be able to make some of these tough decisions.
Thank you, Rihanna, and good luck this week. So there you go. So you might even be talking to Adrian's secret crush, as he just admitted. But basically, you can't assume that your negotiators are reading the stuff that you're writing. However, what I'm about to show you is kind of a key little gem. So this is a negotiator from Australia, and what I had done is I created a list of top 10 negotiators back in 2012. And I did it as a bit of a joke because I was, as Natasha has kind of alluded to, a bit disillusioned. And I was just like, oh, let's just write a really funny article where I talk about the top 10 negotiators. And I talked about some of them in very unflattering ways. Some of the negotiators didn't react as well as he did. But I thought it was obviously a joke, and it was just something that I cooked up in the back of my mind, and asked a few other negotiators for inputs on it and a few other NGO people. But it was just something I thought would be fun to do, and potentially something that, you know, just would make me happy and maybe make some other people happy, because I got to use a lot of adjectives about negotiators in very fun ways. So if you want to read that, I can send you the actual article. But basically, I included the Australian negotiator there on my list as a bit of a joke, but also as I thought he did an okay job as well as a negotiator, not from a policy perspective, but just as a personality. So anyway, this is an email I got from him. That says, on a personal note, may I also say a big thank you to Adopt a Negotiator for choosing me. Was one of your top 10 negotiators at COP18. You're very kind, and I am humbled given the measure of people who I'm working with. So this was an email he sent to the whole Australian civil society stakeholder group. He thought that everyone in Australia and Australian NGOs had got together, and everyone in NGOs across the civil society community, so from around the world, had somehow done some voting system and elected him as one of the top 10 negotiators. And even though this was on a blog that I managed, that at the time I had very, very little readership, it got shared a lot in this conference. It was a very popular article. And he suddenly thought he was on some like really media-worthy news as opposed to just like a pretty small blog that we created. So he suddenly got this idea that he was like massively important and kind of was like, whoa, thank you so much. And ever since then, we had a pretty good relationship, as you can imagine. So the reason why I say this is you can get an article in the Star, you can get an article in Malaysia Kini, you can get an article in the Malay Mail. You can also get an article in a really small blog publication. At the end of the day, it all depends on how you sell it to the negotiator and how they find out about it. If they find out about it because one of their other diplomats shared an article to them, or because you sent them an email saying, look at this article about you, they're still going to be pretty happy about that. And this guy was over the moon. He thought he was on the front page of the New York Times or something. So it doesn't always matter exactly where it's published. Sometimes it's all about how you do it and how you write about it. I know, for example, that on a kind of a Malaysian perspective, there's very, very little media that writes about these negotiations in non-English languages. I work very closely with Latin American youth to write about these negotiations in Spanish, but I know there is very, very little media coverage in Chinese or in Malay, for example. If you write an article about a negotiator or about a specific topic in the negotiations that highlights the negotiator in English or Malay or Tamil or Hindi or whatever language they might be kind of reading or writing, they're probably going to be very, very sensitive to that, whether it's positive or negative. So you probably have a very unique ability to affect the negotiators if you're writing in their languages, if they do speak other languages in the end. So if you do kind of want to take forward a kind of a media approach to this, and you do have kind of second, third, fourth language skills, this could be a very powerful avenue for you to affect someone on a very personal level. So wrapping that up, this is what I tried to present to you in the previous slides. How to impact the negotiations in 10 steps. This is if you're fortunate enough to go to the negotiations, but I also think this is useful for any kind of political conference, any political campaign you might be involved in. So pick one topic. Don't try and learn everything that's going on. Don't try and cover every issue. You may want to kind of start thinking about, okay, what are all the issues and what do I want to focus on? But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter from my perspective. My perspective is pick one topic. I don't care how you get to that topic, just focus on it. You focus on one topic because it's important to you. That's all that matters. You pick that topic. You learn the history of that topic. So you can't jump into a topic and say, okay, I think that everything should change now, if you don't have any perspective on why everything should change now. Sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes the topic you want to influence is at that critical juncture, at that critical moment, and you are at that perfect time when you can like push it over the edge. It doesn't usually happen, and you usually have to know exactly what the history is and what the limits around it is. Anyone who's ever tried to make political change will know that making this change happens not in kind of slow progression. Usually it happens in jumps and starts. So it'll be a slow progression and then suddenly bang. Look at what happened to kind of gay marriage in the US. It's been this like slow progression, and then suddenly a few Supreme Court judges got together and said, yep, actually, why not the whole of the US has to do it? Suddenly the whole of the US has to adopt gay marriage. So it's gone in a slow progression and then a massive start. Whether you agree with it or not, that's what's happened. So the third point, find allies that are going to work with you. Find the other people who care about the topic. I guarantee you, if you're talking about the climate change negotiations, you can't pick a topic that someone else doesn't care about more than you. There are people who literally have been involved in this process for the last 23 years. I know people who have been to every single negotiating meeting of the climate change negotiations since 1990. I'm not kidding. They are still alive. I don't know how, but they are. Find out those people and say that you're interested in the topic. There is no way that they will push you away. Literally, if you have ever worked on a topic for a long time and a young person comes to you and says they want to work on it for free, they will give you a massive hug and they will say, we love you so much. Particularly, and this is just an element of the negotiations, people from developing countries who want to work on these topics are more welcomed than anyone else could be. People from Malaysia, Malaysia is, like I said, a country which doesn't have a lot of people following these topics. If a young Malaysian person wanted to get involved in these topics, went through Adrian and myself, found out the key people who were working on it, trust me, you would be welcomed with open arms. People would want to take you out for lunch all the time, and kind of see what input you can bring and what perspective you can bring as a young Malaysian. Create / join a working group to meet every day. So this is during the conference itself. There will be meetings every day. You try and work on it. You're going to say, okay, what happened in the negotiations today? What protests could we do? What media-worthy moment should we make? Should we write an article about it? Should we focus on something? You're going to talk every day. It kind of helps things get rolling. If you only have 2 weeks, it's not a long time. If you're looking at another conference, it's a domestic political conference or a business conference here, you've probably got much less than 2 weeks. You're going to have to meet quite a lot and figure out exactly what you're doing, pool your resources. Then locate your allies in the negotiations. So this is like finding the Yeb Sanyos. Find the people who are willing to stand up and make this a really key issue, and find the people who can support it from the inside. Create a specific ask and a handout. So this is when you dive into the text, you find out exactly what you want to ask, exactly what you want to see happen in a very, very short way. And this might sound really old tech, but print it out, put a nice picture on it, and give it to the negotiators in their hands. The worst case scenario, they will look at it and throw it away. Best case scenario, they will take it with them, sit on their desk, and as I was telling Adrian before we got here, there are actually occasions in the negotiations where we've handed things to negotiators. They've then grabbed the microphone as soon as they go into the negotiations and go, look, this young person just gave me this article. I'm going to read it out, and I think it's absolutely correct, and this is exactly what our country's position is going to be on this issue. Thank you very much. Please include it in the negotiations. And then there's been times when that's been objected to, but other times when that's been really strongly supported. And that's how a lot of policy change has happened. It sounds really strange, really low tech, but in the end of the day, that's how people are sometimes. Locate your key voices. So this is when you take your allies and you get the information, but then you locate who can be the key voices. Both the negotiators, so the politicians, for example, or kind of the key business people involved in your business conference, but then also who are the outsiders who can be the key voices. So this is like the Anjalis. Who are the key young people who could stand up and make a big statement on this? And why should they be the people who make the statements? Anjali was obviously a great example, had a great presence. It sounds weird also, but also photogenic, was really, really great voice for that. Very passionate and a really amazing presentation. Locate your key amplifiers. So these are the media. So who can you get to cover your story? Who can you get to amplify your story? So this is when you take media people out for lunch. If you don't know what I'm talking about, talk to Natasha, who goes to a lot of lunches, I'm guessing. But basically, find out journalists who are there. Find out journalists who might be interested. Find their emails. Find their home numbers. Find their Twitter accounts. Find out how you can find out about them. Tell them about your story, become friends with them, and see if they can amplify your story. Create media-worthy moments for them. So this is when you give them bait so they can grab onto. So you create those photos, you create those protests, you create those times when they can write about it. And then you get your story out there. Then kind of make sure your negotiator finds it and repeat this process with your enemies. So if it doesn't work by simply promoting the Yeb Sanyos and you have to do the protests and then kind of tell your government that you're protesting and all this stuff, then you do it that. Then you kind of, I would recommend going back and forth. Create a good cop, bad cop kind of thing. Highlight your heroes, then highlight your enemies, highlight your heroes, highlight your enemies, go back and forth. If you haven't won it by then, you've done a damn good job, and I would congratulate you, and you should still go out and celebrate no matter what the outcome was. But I guarantee you, you'd be much, much closer to an outcome if you follow that process than you would without following it. Finally, if you do end up coming to the negotiations, you will enjoy a lot of camaraderie, whereby at the end of the day, you're up late at night. So this is an example of when, so I'm over on the left there by the curtains, a bunch of other, it looks like a lot of guys surrounding, but there's basically, over here, there's just a whole ring of people who are asleep. That was at 4 a.m. in the morning. That particular negotiations went until 7 a.m. in the morning, 2 days after they were due to finish. So you're going to have a lot of late nights if you end up going. If you stay, because of time difference, you could be chilling out. It could be 10 a.m. in the morning, and everyone else is like 2 a.m. It's so tired. And you're just like, oh, this looks interesting, and relaxed. But either way, it's a lot of fun, and I've really enjoyed the late nights with the really happy moments as well. So that's my little presentation for today on what young people have done, and I hope you kind of got a little bit of more of an insight into what young people can do at the negotiations. My organization specifically works on kind of that media role that I mentioned at the end, and getting young people published, writing articles around climate change. So if you want to know more about that, I'm happy to kind of tell you. I think I should probably give you guys a break at this stage though, because it's now getting pretty close towards when we said we'd finish this workshop. And I do want to give you some time to kind of ask questions about some of those things that I mentioned. But basically, if you want to know more about my organization and kind of writing articles about climate change, we'd be happy to talk about that at another time. Otherwise, why don't we go this way this time? And you don't have to ask a question. Some people didn't like Zapsing, some people don't like questions. But if you do want to ask a question, we'll go around kind of one at a time we can ask. So. Sure. I mean, it's definitely something you need to take into light. So, for example, we showed the clip of Abigail, the young girl from the US, and basically they had a pretty horrible relationship with the US throughout the negotiations. And ever since, there's been always quite a tense relationship between US young people and negotiators. It's changed a little bit this year because the US has made a lot more positive steps, and suddenly they're getting a lot more support from civil society. But that's basically a decision that you have to make, though I would say it's not a black and white decision. You can mediate that very well. So if you do think that there's an issue that, as a Malaysian young person, you want to really advocate on, I would say go through a lot of consultations, but be prepared at one point to put your foot down and say, look, if you don't do this by this time, we have to kind of show that we want that to happen. And how you then express that is not something that I can kind of say. But I will say that nonviolent direct action doesn't necessarily mean that you cancel a relationship with a negotiator. I have seen other relationships whereby, say there's a group of 10 young people, kind of 3 of them work very closely with the negotiators and say, look, there's a group of young people who are very upset about this and they really want to act on it. Are you sure you can't move on it? Negotiators will say, look, we really can't. We've got the word from the head. And they'll say, okay, well, I want to give you a heads up. They are going to do an action on it. They are going to protest it. And it's not going to be violent, but they are going to protest it and they are going to make their voices heard. Having that sort of relationship with key negotiators means that when they do see that, they understand it, they're not surprised by it, and they know it's not a personal attack on them. They know that you as a young person believe that this is a policy that people superior to them should change, and you want to make a stand, and they most likely will respect that, depending on how you go about it. there's obviously ways that you can go about it if you want to purposely disrespect them, but that's totally up to you. I would say that as long as you kind of continue that consultative relationship, you understand that the negotiators are people, they are just doing their job, and that they are doing it as best they can most of the time. And I know from personal experience, Malaysian negotiators are, many of them are working very hard, and many of them are doing a great job within the framework that they're given. But I also know that anyone can be pushed to do more in their job, regardless of where they're from, and that if you do have a passion and an energy, that anyone can be driven to kind of push the boundaries of what they work in and maybe make more progress. So I would advise kind of consultations and being frank and honest with people and respecting them as individuals who are doing a job, who might not have all the power. But at the end of the day, you have to also make sure that they respect your ability to raise your voice. So, you know, that's a balance that every culture is different. I know, for example, colleagues in the Middle East, like the Arab Youth Climate Coalition, have a very different way of going about things than colleagues in the US, for example. And you just have to kind of figure out what those cultural boundaries are. But I would kind of recommend that you push them as well. Recommend that you challenge them, and recommend that you make sure that your negotiators know that if you are passionate about something, that you're not just going to take, oh, we can't do it because of this as a final answer. You're going to try and push that even as far as it can go. And as long as you're in close consultations with them, and as long as you make sure that you make it clear that you respect them, and you try and kind of ask that they respect your opinions, I think that should, like, that would work in most cultures. And then you figure out what cultural barriers there are that kind of frame what you can do or what you can't do. But at the end of the day, that's something that definitely people get right and wrong all the time. So I've been wrong before about the way to use protest and nonviolent direct action. Some of the things that we've done have been useful. So I'm definitely not an expert in it. And it's definitely something that, you know, I think talking with other young Malaysians, getting their perspectives, would be very useful. So I'm not necessarily based here, I guess, especially not in Kuala Lumpur. I used to have like a very, very strong connection to Sabah, and that was with some other kind of, I guess, previous relationships that I had there, and kind of ongoing relationships as well. At the moment, I'm working in an international organization that focuses on these climate negotiations, and unfortunately that means I'm not really based anywhere. And I've kind of, Adrian caught me at a very good time when I'm passing through on my way to Singapore tomorrow for the ASEAN Power Shift, and because of my kind of past connection here, and also like a close interest and a passion for what's going on here, I thought it was a great chance to chat with some people, and particularly if those people are interested in going to the negotiations, I'd love to kind of connect with you and kind of be involved. And if that means further on relationships around climate change in Malaysia, then that's something I'd love to kind of explore as well. You want to zap it across? Yeah, so I think that's something that Adrian's trying to kind of get people involved in here. I would say kind of outside of that, there is a number of of kind of international NGOs as well, who kind of focus on this stuff, and that anyone from any country can and kind of get involved in as well. So if you did want to get involved, it's basically just kind of putting your hand up, and then probably whoever you put your hand up to will send you a bunch of resources to try and get you updated on certain things, and then it's kind of up to you to try and see how you want to be involved. There are some NGOs who are professionally based NGOs that you can apply for jobs. There are other NGOs that are kind of voluntary based NGOs, and I know, for example, within this region, there isn't a lot of NGOs that kind of focus on climate negotiations. However, here in Kuala Lumpur, you have, for example, the home base of an organization called Third World Network, who specialize in these negotiations and are some of those people who've been to every single negotiations ever. And they have a lot of kind of interns that might be involved. You also have kind of Adrian's Malaysian youth delegation that you can get involved in. And also, while it might be difficult here in Malaysia, you can always approach your respective government department and ask, can you be involved in some way? Can you find out about how to kind of be involved in the team, and kind of see how you might be able to support that. But also, if you wanted to be involved more kind of generally in the youth constituency, you can easily kind of contact me or Adrian, find out about what is called Youngo. You can find out about them on Facebook, on the youth climate movement, and kind of sign up on your own, or I can kind of lead you through it. And that's a way of kind of generally being involved. In terms of physically getting to these conferences, it can be quite difficult. This year in Paris, it's going to be particularly difficult, not just because of funding, but because of limited UN spots for young people. But for example, if any of you are involved in media, there's going to be another round of media accreditations where anyone from a media organization can apply to go. And if they're able to self-fund, then probably, and convince their organization to support them, then they could probably go that way. And if anyone wants to try that avenue, if anyone's not from a media organization, they can always start blogging for maybe Lawyer Buruk or maybe one of the other kind of open source blogging platforms, and maybe see after a while if they can get that organization to help them get accreditation and stuff. And if anyone wants to explore that, I can help them. Sure. So I told you about the acronyms, right? Like I don't like them. Yeah, but just don't say them around me. Yeah, exactly. That one. No, basically, yeah. Anyone. All right. So the first question: what's being negotiated? In a very broad sense, in 2012, they made a decision that okay, we've had this kind of negotiations for a while, whereby developed countries have to make compulsory actions, and developing countries can make kind of voluntary actions to kind of stop climate change, if you like, in a basic way. And they decided in 2012 we need to work towards a situation whereby we've got a whole change in the global economy. Places like China, places like Turkey, South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia are not the countries they were in 1990. We have to kind of reconfigure that, and we have to figure out a way that we can get everyone on board, everyone taking action on climate change in a compulsory way, and everyone working together to try and do it at the same way, so it doesn't disproportionately affect one economy more than it affects another economy. So Brazil is not feeling kind of left out by Indonesia, competing on forestry products and stuff, and Brazil's doing more than Indonesia, and then they're like, hey, we're not going to do this because we're affecting our economy and stuff. So we're trying to progress towards that, and basically all across the negotiations, they're trying to progress towards that. They're going to work on some key outcomes of the conference will be a long-term goal. So maybe by year 2030, 2040, 2050, 2060, some sort of agreement that says by that year, we're going to make a commitment for zero fossil fuels or kind of net carbon neutrality or something like that, that basically means we're going to all aim towards that year to cut down fossil fuel use. There's going to be another thing around global adaptation goal. So we're going to all work towards trying to make sure our communities are less vulnerable to climate change impacts in these ways. There's another big set of negotiations on finance, which is something that Yeb was talking about quite a bit, whereby we have this kind of $100 billion target that $100 billion will be placed directly towards climate adaptation and mitigation, so reducing fossil fuels and adapting to climate change in developing countries by 2020, and then kind of what's going to happen after 2020 in terms of finance support for developing countries in particular. They're kind of like the big three things, and then there's a whole array of like subcategories that are being negotiated. But then there's also all these sub-topic interests. So if you care about human rights, there's a whole thing on human rights. If you care about intergenerational equity, future generations having the same sort of rights as now, there's this whole thing on that. Gender, there's this whole thing on that. You just kind of pick your topic and then, try and push that more and more importance. So there's a whole layer of things, but they're the big broad ones. In terms of the types of people that go, there are 9 civil society groups within the kind of UN system for climate change. There's farmers, Adrian, help me out, farmers, environmental NGOs, there's research groups, so universities, there is business interests, there is young people, there is women, there is trade unions, and Indigenous peoples. Oh my God, I'm never going to live down that was last. And there is youth. So basically, these different constitutions, many people cross many different things. Obviously, any young woman could be in the gender constituency. I mean, so could any man, but like specifically, and like a young Indigenous woman, for example, would potentially be in 3. She might also be part of a trade union. She might also be at a university. Suddenly, she's in every group. But there are specific kind of interests that each of those groups represent, and they try and push in the negotiations. So trade unions try and push for a fair transition where workers' rights aren't affected. So workers in coal factories don't lose their jobs without being retrained, and workers in renewable energies have the right kind of government pushes to let them get more and more jobs and create bigger industries. Indigenous rights kind of are protected in climate change action. So not only their lands are protected, but also if there's any processes that might use forests to try and protect the climate, that Indigenous people aren't kicked out of those forests, for example. There's a whole range of different aspects that each group think are important, but there's also a whole range of things that everyone agrees on. So the whole negotiations are effectively, in one way or another, linked to climate change. It is the kind of UN climate change negotiations in the end. So I guess it doesn't matter what topic you pick; it's somehow linked in. Me personally, yeah, I think it's kind of critical, and at the moment, I've kind of throughout the years, I've thought that different things are really, really critical. In my first year, I focused on forest and Indigenous peoples. In kind of later years, I looked at mitigation. So specifically looking at Australia and trying to cut down Australia's role. This year, I'm kind of more in a more oversight position, and I'm more focused on getting as many young people kind of interested and involved in this process as possible, and therefore, I guess in my perspective, allowing like those people to take forward their specific interests a lot better. So I guess it's kind of changed over the years, and everyone has different focuses, and I kind of over the years have learned to respect those different focuses as much as I respected individual topics in the past. But now, like I said, I think the best thing for any person to do, young person or whatever, pick a specific topic, really focus on that topic, and don't necessarily worry if other people think it's important or not. only thing that matters is if you think it's important, you have passion, and you kind of follow that topic as much as you can, and put as much pressure on that topic as possible. And I think that's the best thing young people can do. And if you do follow those 10 steps I laid out, probably you'll create a bit of media attention, probably you'll create a bit of pressure on your negotiators, and then who knows what happens. It's just up to you how much you continue it. Thanks, everyone. We've now gone a little bit over time, and I just wanted to thank you all. You're all welcome to play Zapzing whenever you want. I think it's almost the best way to wake up with your family, but other people object. But you're also welcome to kind of contact me or contact Adrian at any point and ask us more questions or get involved in this kind of international youth movement. And maybe, at one point you'll be seeing yourself on YouTube making a big speech or doing a big protest or kind of winning this wonderful victory or celebrating. Sometimes you don't want to be on YouTube when you're celebrating though. But yeah, I hope you've all enjoyed. Thanks so much for coming out in the rain, and I hope I haven't talked too much.
To those who's following us on Google Hangout, thank you. That's the end for an extended session today. I hope you enjoyed as much as we do. I'll see you soon. Any questions, any comments, please email us or tweet us at PowerShift Malaysia #. And we'll see you in the next session. Thank you.